day, listeners, and welcome to Integrity Initiative, Unveiling Global Anti-Corruption Strategies podcast. I'm Ishitha, residing in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and I'm currently in Year 11 at GEMS Winchester School, Dubai. I'm an eco-warrior of the Sustainability Club in my school as part of the GEMS Global Ambassadors Society with a keen interest in STEM and scientific understanding, the Undersecretary General of WSD Model United Nations, the editor-in-chief of WSD Humanities Club, an enthusiastic programmer, a passionate drummer, as well as a proud winner of the Sheikha Fatima bint Mubarak Award of Excellence 2024 to 2025. And if you haven't figured it out yet, I will be hosting this prolific session today. For those of you joining us, thank you so much for being part of this vital conversation. As we embark on this journey together, we are about to uncover the hidden forces that shape political systems. In this podcast, we will dissect the complex web of political corruption, explore groundbreaking strategies to combat it, and engage with visionary experts who would like to enlighten us with their insights on this subject matter. So, without further ado, let us dive right in. First up, in our list of esteemed guests, we have Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a paragon of intellectual prowess and diplomatic finesse. This erudite Indian politician, prolific author, and former United Nations diplomat has carved an indelible mark on the global stage. From 1978 to 2007, Mr. Tharoor was a career official at the United Nations, rising to the rank of Undersecretary General for Communications and Public Information in 2001 under the leadership of Kofi Annan. He announced his retirement after finishing second in the 2006 election for UN Secretary General to Ban Ki-moon. His eloquence, coupled with a remarkable command of the English language, has captivated audiences worldwide. A four-time Member of Parliament representing Trivandrum constituency in India, Mr. Tharoor seamlessly transitioned from international diplomacy to the arena of Indian politics. He has published 26 books showcasing his versatility as a wordsmith and thinker. Recognized as a global leader of tomorrow by the World Economic Forum at Davos, Mr. Tharoor's influence extends far beyond the realms of politics and literature. So, Mr. Shashi Tharoor, your first question is, how do international organizations like United Nations enforce measures to combat political corruption?
On the first question, the United Nations has no particular sovereign power. It is, after all, an organization of member states, and the member states have the authority to enforce actions against political corruption. The United Nations does not. In fact, the United Nations should be thought of more as a stage, and the states, that is, the governments of various countries, are the actual actors. What the United Nations can do is to encourage common standards, to try and identify processes through which governments are able to tackle issues, to share experiences across nations, to make best practices known to each other, and of course to exalt the highest standards available internationally. But thereafter, it is entirely up to the countries themselves how seriously they wish to act on it, not up to the United Nations.
Great start, Mr. Shashi Tharoor. I'm able to grasp the direction you're heading with this logical reasoning. Although the United Nations is not solely responsible for the political corruption in each of the nations, could you elaborate more on what the United Nations have done up till now to ensure that there is political stability in various countries around the world, and how they can aid the future generations to abide by the same or even more effective measures to eradicate this issue?
Ishitha, you've got my answer to your first question about international organizations like the UN enforcing measures. As I said, the UN has no enforcement authority, but it's worth mentioning in this context that the United Nations Convention Against Corruption is signed and ratified by many member states, and that provides a comprehensive legal framework for preventing corruption, prosecuting offenders, and facilitating international cooperation. And there's also the United Nations Office on Drugs and crime being, of course, corruption as well. And that means that that office can play a role in monitoring compliance and in supporting countries to implement the provisions of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. So though it's up to governments to enforce or not up to the UN, I do want to say that additionally, the UN can provide technical assistance, policy recommendations, and funding to strengthen national anti-corruption institutions. And that, of course, is something which the UN can do to help governments that really want to enforce actions against corruption and creates effective anti-corruption strategies where if international collaboration is welcome, the UN can always facilitate it. Well done, Ishitha, for thinking about all of this.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tharoor. You've highlighted the crucial role of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in the global fight against corruption. Your insights are spot on. The UNCSC, adopted in 2003, is indeed a landmark agreement. It's remarkable that about 98% of UN member states have signed this convention, making it the most comprehensive and universally accepted anti-corruption instrument. As you rightfully pointed out, the UNODC is able to provide direct support in developing and implementing anti-corruption strategies due to the extensive network of 150 countries. As you mentioned, the UN provides technical assistance, policy recommendations, and funding. Your point about international collaboration is crucial in order for political leaders to tackle worldwide issues. So, on to the second question, Mr. Tharoor. In your experience, what are the most effective strategies for building public trust in anti-corruption efforts?
Let me say that requires a lot of things. It requires, of course, a combination of transparency, accountability, public engagement, public consciousness, and of course, the public must feel through the provision of effective examples from other parts of the world that a corruption-free country is a country that works better for all of them, and they would be better off that way. One of the most effective strategies in ensuring independent oversight institutions that can investigate and act against corruption without political interference, that would be one of the most effective strategies. And if governments can do that, that'll be terrific. And of course, when people see that enforcement agencies are operating with integrity, then they will start trusting, and you'll be able to build public trust in anti-corruption efforts. Information is very important. Public should know what's going on. They should have access. That's why the famous anti-corruption ranking is called Transparency International. They want transparent information, open data initiatives, whistleblower protections, digital transparency tools. All of this can help the citizens to monitor government spending and decision-making. And that also helps in building trust. In India, we have the RTI Act, the Right to Information Act, under which people can actually ask questions about how taxpayer money is being spent, for example. And that would be a way of ensuring that public trust is also further built up. Then consistent enforcement of laws, regardless of any political influence or clout, is very important, because when high-profile offenders face consequences, it reinforces public confidence in the system. And finally, engaging civil society and the media will play a vital role. awareness campaigns, public consultations, partnerships with NGOs, RTI, maybe even sort of public rankings of states that are more honest, less corrupt than others. All of this will help create a culture of accountability and awareness, and that will help build public trust as well. When people see tangible actions and not just rhetoric in the fight against corruption, then they will believe.
Thank you once again, Mr. Tharoor, for such a comprehensive and thoughtful response. I couldn't agree more that when citizens see practical actions being implemented, it builds trust and strengthens the culture of integrity. Your point about independent oversight institutions is equally prominent. These bodies must operate free from political interference to ensure fair investigations and enforcement. Tools like India's RTI Act are excellent examples of empowering citizens to hold governments responsible. I also love your emphasis on civil society and media involvement. State rankings based on transparency can inspire healthy competition and foster accountability. These strategies, combined with public trust and engagement, are truly the foundation of a corruption-free society. I'm sure that the listeners, and especially me, will acknowledge the time you have taken to join us in this podcast, despite your busy schedule, to traverse the intricate world of politics and political corruption. This, according to me, is what truly sets Mr. Tharoor apart. It is his visionary perspective on youth empowerment. Furthermore, he champions the latent potential of young minds, recognizing their capacity to catalyze societal metamorphosis and spearhead transformative initiatives. I think we should also acknowledge the broadened ideas you thought of in this discussion, which countries can implement into their governmental and political systems despite their historical background on political corruption.
All the very best to you, Ishitha.
With that being said, we will be moving on to the second esteemed guest of this podcast, Mr. Rahul Easwar, who is a distinguished philosopher, author, and an activist. He's a part of 3 Guinness World Records and has written 3 books that explores the intersection of philosophy, education, and ancient wisdom with modern scientific discoveries. Mr. Easwar is also a 3-time TEDx speaker. His oratory skills have taken him to over 10 countries, including the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Japan, and the Middle East, where he has delivered lectures to diverse audiences. Mr. Easwar has participated in more than 1,200 debates on national and regional media platforms. He has been featured in prominent media outlets such as the BBC, the CNN, the New York Times, and Al Jazeera. His writings have appeared in esteemed publications like The Hindu, The Times of India, The Indian Express, and The Deccan Chronicle, solidifying his position as a leading intellectual voice. Now that we've had a chance to have a deeper understanding about our second guest, let us move on to the questions. So, Mr. Rahul Easwar, for the first question, to what extent does political corruption diminish a country from being successful in terms of economic growth, social trust, political stability, and foreign relations?
Hi, Ishitha. For the first question, Pope Francis once said, corruption is paid by the poor. Pranab Mukherjee, former president of India, Bharat Ratna, rightly points out, corruption is the enemy of development and good governance. We must get rid of it. Both the government and the people at large must come together to achieve this national objective. Now, let's look at the impact on social trust. Corruption erodes trust in public institutions, leading to civic disengagement, disillusionment. The Edelman Trust Barometer 2024 found out that in highly corrupt nations, trust in government falls below 30%. Whereas in countries with an anti-corruption framework like Denmark or New Zealand, it exceeds 70%. So you can understand that trust is different. I was in Finland last year, 2023 to be precise. I could understand the good structural frameworks that they have. Countries with lower corruption, for example, Finland, Norway, they score higher on World Happiness Report, and Finland is the happiest nation in the world. While nations which are plagued by corruption, such as Afghanistan, South Sudan, they rank the lowest. There is an impact on political stability too. The corruption breeds, or the acts of corruption breeds political instability by fostering an elite capture, weakening democratic institutions and triggering unrest among people. The Fragile States Index 2023 identifies corruption as a key driver of state failure in nations such as Syria, Haiti, and Yemen. In Africa, students suggest that a 1 point increase in perceived corruption corresponds to a 5% increase in civil unrest incidents. For example, there was also a case study regarding the Arab Spring, which was largely fueled by corruption and economic mismanagement in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. And regarding your very important question on foreign relations, that's also very important. A country riddled with corruption struggles to maintain strong diplomatic ties. Nations with high corruption risk losing access to international funding, trade benefit, strategic alliances. The OECD Anti-Bribery Convention and the Foreign Corruption Practices Act, FCPA of the US, have led to sanctions and restrictions on corrupt nations. Things in US may change, courtesy Donald Trump taking some policies may come into effect that we can know, but no, right now the structures are strong. In 2023, the European Union suspended a 7.5 billion euro in funding to Hungary over corruption concerns. Similarly, Nigeria lost $1.1 billion in oil revenue annually due to corrupt practices. Corruption is a multi-dimensional threat to national success. The antidote lies in transparent governance, strong judicial framework, public accountability, and most importantly, personal ethics, like Mahatma Gandhi said. We should be the change we want to see in the world. Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General, once said, if corruption is a disease, transparency is the central part of its treatment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Easwar. Now that you have managed to accumulate this discussion with numerous statistical figures, let us take a moment to reflect on your analysis that highlights the complex nature of this issue. It is crucial that both governments and citizens work together to combat this issue. The Edelman Trust Barometer that you mentioned reveals a concerning trend. The erosion of trust creates a vicious cycle undermining economic health and social cohesion. Your observations about Finland align with research showing that countries with lower corruption tend to score higher on well-being indices. The International Monetary Fund has found that corruption significantly damages economic growth, foreign direct investments, and tax revenues, while also negatively impacting income distribution and inclusive growth. Regarding political stability, corruption indeed results in elite capture, weakens democratic institutions, and triggers distrust among people, such as in a study on Africa that you referenced. The individual level change combined with transparent governance and strong institutions is indeed relevant in combating corruption effectively. Now, let us move on to the second question. What are the possible economic and diplomatic implications that could arise from external disruption on operations within a corrupt government?
Political corruption is one of the greatest impediments to national development. It is eroding economic growth, social cohesion, governance stability, and international credibility too. It acts as an economic drain, an institutional failure, a reputational risk, preventing a nation from realizing its full potential. Now, let me point out some areas, for example, economic growth. Corruption stifles economic progress by diverting resources from productive sectors. Let's look at some statistics. According to a study by IMF, International Monetary Fund, corruption reduces GDP growth by 1 to 2% annually in developing economies. The World Bank estimates that nearly 1.5 trillion, I repeat, 1.5 trillion is lost globally to corruption each year. Disproportionately, it affects developing nations. Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, or CPI 2023, shows a direct correlation between corruption and weak economic performance. Nations with higher corruption, for example, a nation like Sudan, many people also quote nations like Venezuela, they suffer from a capital flight. People move out, reduced foreign direct investment, FDI, and lower job creation.
That's great, Mr. Easwar. The facts that you have provided paints a stark picture of corruption's devastating effects. The IMF's estimate of a 1 to 2% annual GDP growth reduction due to corruption in developing economies is indeed alarming. To put this into context, over a decade, this could mean there would be a significant difference between economic advancement and stagnation. I'm sure the listeners are quite appalled by that. The World Bank's estimate of $1.5 trillion lost annually to corruption is even more staggering. To further emphasize this figure, it's more than the combined GDP of many smaller nations. This massive drain on resources could otherwise be used for crucial development projects, healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The thoughts that you have provided reinforce your argument that corruption is indeed a major hindrance to national development, affecting social cohesion, governance, and international credibility. Now, let us move on to the third and final question for Mr. Rahul Easwar. Should anti-corruption strategies focus more on individual accountability or systematic reform?
Let's just look back in a nutshell the issues of corruption, especially regarding international relationships and diplomatic implications. Loss of foreign direct investment, or FDI. World Bank found a 1 point increase in corruption perception leads to 20% drop in FDI inflows. Who would like to invest in a corrupt country? No one would, right? For example, in 2018, the Malaysian 1MDB scandal led to a 35% decline in foreign investment. Capital flight and currency depreciation. See, when corruption is exposed and understood and comprehended, capital flees to stable economies, transparent economies, more trustable economies. The African Development Bank reports that corruption-induced capital flight, it costed Africa nearly 88.6 billion annually. In 2019, when Zimbabwe's corruption scandal surfaced, its currency depreciated by over 200% in 1 year. These are prominent studies from world over. International aid and trade sanctions also do happen. Even though I don't want to take the recent examples that are involving in India, which may be controversial, which may be subject to change, let's take 1 or 2 international examples. The US Global Magnitsky Act allows sanction on corrupt official, leading to frozen assets and travel bans. As a case study, in 2019, Angola lost over $100 million in World Bank funding due to mismanagement in government projects. So diplomatic implications are also there. Loss of geopolitical leverage. Leverage we can understand as influence. The loss of geopolitical leverage, they lose their bargaining power. Legal and security challenges, shift in alliances. Corruption is a cancer in the soul of any nation for that matter. So how to counter them is also an important question. We should focus equally on individual accountability and systemic reform. Because as many thinkers, including Baba Sahib Ambedkar, pointed out, the best system will work only as much as the best people in it perform. So there should be a space for both systemic reform and personal accountability. Whistleblower protection, judicial independence, data-driven transparency, institutional overhaul, like they have done in Singapore and Sweden with great regulatory framework, are absolutely yes. The case for individual accountability, we need to have prosecution as deterrence. South Korea even jailed some former presidents for corruptions. China's anti-corruption drive. So a nation like Singapore can be a good example. They have established Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, or what they call CPIB, strict penalties for corrupt officials, implementing public service reforms for transparency. India has also done something like right to information, which is very important. Whistleblower protection should also be there. So systemic reforms should be addressing root causes, whereas individual accountability and ethics should also be there. And we should all remember we cannot afford to be corrupt. We have to build institutions and inspire ethics that will inspire nations to be clean and remain clean. And let me end with a quote by one of the most significant people to have ever walked on earth, Mahatma Gandhi, the father of India. He rightly said, a corrupt society is like a dying tree. It may look green and healthy from the outside, but it is rotten within. This is quoted in his work and writings on ethics and governance. So it is very significant. And congrats, Ishitha, for taking this topic.
Thank you once again, Mr. Rahul Easwar. I'm sure that the additional views that you shared enables the listeners to further comprehend the gravity of this issue. Corruption's far-reaching impacts on foreign direct investments, capital flight, and international relations underscore the urgent need for comprehensive anti-corruption strategies. As you rightly pointed out, combining systematic reform with individual accountability is key to fostering a culture of integrity and sustainable economic development. To culminate this part of the podcast, me and the listeners would like to give you our heartfelt thanks for being able to display utmost interest to discussing this topic of political corruption, mainly centering around global strategies that governments and countries can adapt into their own political systems.
I would like to appreciate Ishitha Riyadh, Year 11 student, GEMS Winchester School, for taking up such an important aspect. And I hope our next generation will be able to correct the corrupt practices that is there in the world.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rahul Easwar. I really appreciate it. As we disseminate the key takeaways from this conversation, it is very evident that the discussion with Mr. Shashi Tharoor and Mr. Rahul Easwar has been both interactive and engaging. I think it's about time to reveal the main objective of this podcast to our inquisitive listeners. Integrity. It is the cornerstone of a just and prosperous society. Integrity in this podcast serves as both a preventive measure and a guiding light for effective anti-corruption strategies. When integrity is valued, those who speak out against corruption are more likely to be supported and protected. This way, we can create a robust defense against corruption and pave the way for sustainable development and prosperity. Seeing as our list of esteemed guests has elapsed, we will be having one more special guest who has been able to dedicate his entire career to tackling political corruption head on. Mr. A.K. Antony, the former Minister of Defense in India, who earned the nickname Mr. Clean for his strident fight against corruption in Indian politics. Throughout his term as a minister from 2006 to 2014, Mr. Antony staunchly shielded the defense procurement process from any form of irregularity. Even during his days as a minister, Mr. Antony's steps against corruption were highly effective. As he himself remarked, there is no compromise when it comes to corruption. You have to fight it. Unconventional and firm commitment to integrity is how people will remember Mr. Antony's legacy as India's defense minister. In an era where politicians are often assumed to be corrupt or have seized power by unprincipled means, Mr. A.K. Antony is something that is out of the ordinary, which made him a principled politician who garnered admiration from various factions for his candor in politics. The question that was addressed to Mr. A.K. Antony was, as a leader who has dealt with anti-corruption efforts in India during the tenure 2006 to 2014, how do you think developing nations can collaborate more effectively on an international level to combat political corruption, especially in the face of differing legal systems and cultural attitudes towards governance? Mr. A.K. Antony has sent his response via text, so I'll be reading it out to all the keen listeners out there. This question is certainly stimulating and tackles a significant matter. In my view, Ishitha, developing nations have the potential to collaborate effectively in addressing political corruption through various strategies. They can promote knowledge sharing through regional conferences and international forums, establish unified standards such as integrity pacts to guarantee transparency, and utilize technology including open data initiatives and advanced analytics to enhance accountability. Furthermore, enhancing capacity through the sharing of expertise and resources can fortify anti-corruption agencies. Regardless of variations in legal systems and cultural contexts, the principles of transparency and accountability remain universally applicable. By coming together around these values and promoting public engagement and education, nations can establish a robust foundation for collectively combating corruption and cultivate a culture that denounces it. We have finally come to the end of this podcast. We've explored some remarkably enlightening insights into this topic, and I hope you found them as illuminating as I did. Just to recap, we were privileged to have three notable guests who each contributed their unique expertise into this podcast. First, Mr. Shashi Tharoor, as an accomplished Indian politician, writer, former Under-Secretary General at the United Nations, has been able to provide us thoughts on the UN's pivotal role in combating corruption through his on-the-ground experience. Second, Mr. Rahul Easwar, a philosopher and an activist, international lecturer in over 10 countries, and a participant in more than 1,200 debates, has offered in-depth insights into the world of political corruption and his detailed figures which made all of us captivated into this exchange of views. And last but not the least, Mr. A.K. Antony, former Defense Minister of India, who have candidly executed multiple approaches to prevent corruption on a global scale, shared his specialized perspective on confronting corruption through effective strategies. Thank you so much for tuning into this podcast of Integrity Initiative, Unveiling Global Anti-Corruption Strategies. Ishitha signing off.